Hello, my name is Michael Todoran, and I am today's guest. I'm today's host of the Landscape Architecture podcast. And today's guest is um, Kofi Boone. And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. My name is Kofi Boone. I'm a professor of landscape architecture at NC State University, which is in North Carolina, and happy to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so I wanted to begin this conversation on an article that you wrote in 2018 called Black Landscapes Matter.
Mhm.
And just to put it in context, it is June 2nd, 2020, and there's a lot of protests going on right now,
Mhm.
and your article seems to be resurging and relooked at, and I think it's a very important article. Can you tell me a little bit about why you wrote it and how you view that article?
Sure, Michael. It's great to be able to talk about it again. How I view the Black Landscapes Matter article. A little bit of backstory about it, which actually comes back to California. Um, I have a good friend, one of the great landscape architects, Walter Hood, who teaches at Berkeley and practices out of Oakland. And at that time, he called and said, "Hey, we're having this one-day symposium called Black Landscapes Matter." And I said, "Oh, that's an interesting title. It's like, you got to come out and give a talk," is what he said. And it's like, "Oh, um, what should I talk about?" And it's like, "Oh, you'll figure it out." And that was that was it. And if you know Walter, that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah.
But he framed it. He did frame it where he talked about the anniversary at that time of the insurrection in South Central, as well as the last time there was a cover article, Black Landscape Architects and Landscape Architecture magazine. So it had been decades since both of those things had happened. And so he offered those two as prompts, to just kind of measure distance. And, at that time, it was, the Black Lives Matter movement, was in an interesting state, and I guess before I go further, I should probably just send condolences and compassion and empathy for people who've lost their lives and their families to police violence. It's a terrible, terrible, different kind of pandemic, right? So we're dealing with COVID right now, but there is a racism pandemic as well that's very deeply rooted in our country. So he offered that as a prompt, and as a part of that, it forced me to do some more research on the Black Lives Matter movement. And its founders are some incredible women who have done the work that was done previously face to face, but using social media, using a lot of tools that we kind of embrace now in the 21st century. But they were pioneers in that regard. But I was struck by Alicia Garza, who's one of the co-founders. She laid out three kind of broad goals of that movement, and they were to be seen, to live with dignity, and to be connected as sort of aspirations. And so, that led to the framing of the talks. So we gave a talk at Berkeley. I gave a talk. Austin Allen, who's now at UT Arlington, gave a talk. There were a number of people who gave talks about different issues, but I tried to frame my talk in a couple different chapters. The first one was really why we don't talk about these kinds of things in landscape architecture. What are some of the reasons why we wouldn't? We're supposed to be about balancing, the human and the non-human parts of the world through what we do. We have a high level of sophistication and a great vocabulary for ecology and for environmental systems. We have a very limited one for human systems. And so, not even getting to the point of racism or white supremacy or other things, just to back up, we are really, we know a lot about behavior, we know a lot about meaning, we know a lot about these things, but in terms of conflict, when we deal with, communities with very different values being forced to reconcile, we have a hard time. And it was also an observation that in terms of representation in our field, why wouldn't young Black kids and young brown kids who grew up in communities that had so many environmental challenges not seek landscape architecture as a pathway to make change? You know, there are a lot of professions that say, hey, you know, we changed the world. I created a new hashtag. I did a new website. You know, I changed the world. And you sit there and you're like, well, landscape architecture literally changes the world, like the shape of the earth when we grade and how systems flow, you know. So why wouldn't we choose that pathway? And, you know, one thing that came out of that reflection that really dealt with the meat of the article is that we have done a very poor job as a profession of telling the story of landscape architecture in a way that includes the communities that we serve. And we have an opportunity, at least at that time, I speculated and put out there using some North Carolina examples of in being more inclusive in the canon. Like when we tell the story of the great works, the great movements, the great theories, the great stories, you know, we need to be more proactive about opening that up. And so the rest of the talk kind of dealt with that. It was transcribed. I kind of forgot about it. But the student journal at Berkeley ground up took it and published it, and it circulated. And just like you said, you know, it seems like the time has returned where, you know, people are asking those questions again, and I'm glad that, you know, people are revisiting it.
Yeah, well, we never know when the writing or lectures that we do are ready to take traction. And I
Right.
think that's why it's important to, you know, it's important to participate and then, of course, move on to different subjects. And then when it's time again for people to catch up, and it's okay, let's go back now and revisit it, which is what is exactly happening right now.
Yeah.
To push that a little bit farther, before we started recording, you know, I was mentioning to you that I was a teenager in Los Angeles during the 1992 riots,
Mm-hmm.
and now being a landscape architect and a dad, and again in Los Angeles, and hearing the sirens and the helicopters, and um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what I was saying was that in 1992, I felt like there was two emotions. One was
Mm-hmm.
anger and one was fear.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, they were divided along cultural lines.
Mm-hmm.
And this time it seems different,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and, and yeah, I just wanted to hear what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, referencing LA, for example, is a great reference. It's something that we talk about, you know, in the circles I'm in. You know, I grew up in Detroit. I was born in 1970, but you know, the big insurrection in Detroit. Detroit is significant because it had its huge insurrection a year before Dr. King died. So we were in that way ahead of the curve. But a similar situation in 1967 where white police officer, killed a Black man in a Black neighborhood near the center city of Detroit, and unleashed, you know, so much pent up rage that a lot of the country. It was 1968. It was after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King where that occurred. Um, so that's sort of a touchstone. And, you know, one thing we've talked about in some of my circles is, you know, there were a lot of things happening at that time. So, you know, the modern civil rights movement was moving. There was also the anti-Vietnam protests that were occurring. And so you, in some cases, had very different groups converging, right? So, you know, Black and brown people were like, look, you know, we still are not free. We still don't have the basic human rights that everyone else enjoys in this country. And also, you had a lot of, quite frankly, predominantly white young people in college who were at risk of being drafted, who were, you know, equally outraged over the fact that they were going to be forced to fight in a war they didn't want to fight in. So what I'm talking about now is that in the streets, you would see mixes, of different kinds of people. Their unity was resistance against government oppression. So Rodney King's, I remember that really vividly. I mean, I remember watching the video, being in disbelief, just like everybody else. I remember thinking that that verdict was a slam dunk, because this is before smartphones and before
Right.
social media, and you're like, they got it on video. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what other evidence to actually? You can just look at it. And I remember, the disbelief when the verdict came in. And you were a high schooler in LA. I was graduating from the University of Michigan. That verdict came out within days of our graduation day. So not only were we in shock and disbelief as college undergrads, but heading into our graduation ceremony, the keynote speaker, completely by serendipity, was George H.W. Bush, the president of the United States, right? So everybody was just like in disbelief. But as we talked about before, our window into your part of the world at that time was hip hop culture and rap music, and
Yeah.
we had a sense that some stuff was going on just through the music. So we listened to NWA and a lot of other folks, and they would talk about it pretty directly. Boys in the Hood, the movie. These were our like windows into that part of the country. So police brutality, violence, that whole conflict was something that we knew, at least just from popular media. So that's the second touch point. And then the rise of the cell phone videos for tragic murders, Mike Brown, a number of others, the Trayvon Martin audio recordings, that went around the country, that kind of unleashed this current wave. But in the current wave, just to get back to that, I think we're in the same kind of boat where there are a lot of people who are converging. I don't think everyone out in the streets is really focused on specifically the recent murders, George Floyd and a number of other people. I think that the response to COVID, I think the huge numbers of unemployment, I think really the lack of a clear vision has put a lot of people's anxiety on maximum. And I think that what we're seeing is some convergence. Like sometimes you see rallies and you see protests, and people are doing the nonviolent direct action kind of things. And then some cases you're seeing like really big time property damage and violence. And I think although they're in the same space, I don't think they're the same people with the same interests. So
I think.
but
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, you're good. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say that I think that the difference is that people are more aware that there is a difference now,
Yeah.
because of the democratization of information, right? So
Yeah.
like immediately people are letting the world know, hey, this is not part of what we're doing. This is an outlier,
Right.
or if you believe in it, this is a agent provocateur,
Right.
or so it's immediately um, things are immediately being identified,
Right.
whereas in the 90s that wasn't the case.
Right.
These things would come to light months and months afterwards,
Right.
and 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 even when they did come to light, they were so late, and I
Yeah.
would suppose watered down might
Yeah.
be the word. And
Yeah.
here it's like this minute by minute fluid
Yeah.
information that's really important. And I think that's that's the change that I was trying to allude to in my analogy
Okay. Sure.
earlier,
Sure.
was that that's what's different, is
Mm.
people are um, more digesting information. And
Mm.
I also think that, you know, speaking for myself, being a white male,
Mm.
uh, I know that I had to go through all of the processes of first, like 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 the 5 stages of grief. I don't
Sure.
know what the 5 stages of this would be, but a couple years back when I was younger, I remember thinking, well, I didn't do anything, it wasn't my
Right.
fault.
Right.
And then I went through that process, and then later on I go through the process of, oh, I can understand my passive role. and
Right.
then and then it just builds and builds and builds to like, okay, I fully accept, and now I want to be an ally.
Mm-hmm.
um and I'm a little bit embarrassed about how long it took that process for me, but it is what it is.
It is what it is.
And then now, I guess that leads to a question, and I'm just going to be very blunt, and that is, you know, as a white male asking you, as a white landscape architect male asking you, what can I do? What can we do?
Yeah, you know, that's a really, really tough question. Uh, in my younger days, when I was in college, one of my heroes was Malcolm X, in which case there's a famous scene in Malcolm X movie where he's coming out of a debate on a college campus,
Oh
and a
yeah, yeah,
white woman
yeah,
comes out just like, "Oh, I believe in your movement.
yeah, yeah,
I wanna- what can I do?" And he looks at her and he kind of goes, "Nothing," and then he walks
yeah.
away.
But in a
So
very Denzel way, right? Just like,
yeah, he was really smooth. Yeah,
yeah,
and I have
yeah,
to
yeah,
say that's one of the real life people who was probably smoother than Denzel Washington. It seems
yeah,
impossible. Malcolm
sure.
X was pretty smooth. All right, but as an old gray-haired man now, what can you do? I think that you know where I am reacting is that um, I'm seeing the impetus to jump too quickly to conclusions about the professional roles that are required in order to resolve some of these problems, which is to
Hmm.
say, we're quickly, the fancy word is problematizing,
Right.
but the idea that we're trying to translate these social issues into physical responses in a short period of time. I think there are some people who've thought about that for a long period of time, social scientists and other folks who have done the actual work to figure that out. But I think landscape architecture is all powerful, but it's not that powerful.
Right.
I think a lot of this is not a hardware problem; it's a software problem, meaning
Interesting.
how we think
Yeah.
about things. And so, I want to build off of your observation about technology. That it was decentralized, it's immediate, it's accessible, it can in real time sort of correct itself with new information. I think that we have to do the human work as human beings first. For example, I'm on a couple of boards. I'm on the Landscape Architecture Foundation board, and I'm on the Conservation Network board. And within a 6-month span, I went through two DEI trainings. Very different DEI
What is
trainings,
that?
or different.
Sorry, what does DEI
D,
stand for?
DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Got it.
And what it is there are professionals out there that are trained in how to facilitate a group process to help people uh, 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 talk about um, privilege, talk about oppression, and then talk about change. Like, how do we start to move that? I found that in my experience, it's very difficult to do it um, on your own. So let's say firms just decided to do it themselves, or universities. You know, I've found that that's hard because unless you have like what people think of as an objective third party, people aren't willing to be vulnerable. They don't trust the process. They're afraid of consequences, saying the wrong thing. Like, there's a lot of like what we might call force fields or walls that keep people from having honest conversations. But I think we all need to learn how to talk about race, and we all have to learn how to talk about white supremacy, and we all have to learn about where our positions are in it. And when we can build that vocabulary, then we have built the software as independent actors. And once we've gone through that work, then we can come together and we can talk about what does that mean in terms of form. What's hard about our profession is it's fee for service, and in a lot of ways, the client's not going to pay you to learn how to deal with race. Some will, like foundations will,
Sure.
so other nonprofits will, but how do you monetize it? And so it's not necessarily going to fit within the corporate model of how we practice, but in institutions like you are, academic institutions, the role of leading organizations to kind of model that behavior and say, we're going to, before we go out and do work, we're going to work on ourselves. Like, this is going to be our proof of concept, right? So that's something that, working with communities for a number of years, that I've found that they resent is they don't want to be guinea pigs.
Right.
They don't want to be the experiment. They don't want to be in a situation where they're exploited and the consultant or the designer is benefiting.
Yeah.
So trial and error of working with Black communities, for example, you blow it and things don't work out, but you've gained a lesson that then you can apply to get more work. Like
Yeah.
communities are actually really savvy about seeing that now. So I think that the first step is really um, the internal work, like you've done, right? It sounds like you've done it, but we all need to do that. And then when that happens, um, the biggest thing I can say is going from non to anti.
Can you expand
So
upon that from
happy
non
to do
to
that.
anti?
Non to anti. I think if you ask most people, even in our profession, are you racist? No. You know.
Oh,
Um,
no, I understand now what you mean. Yeah,
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 yeah. I have black and brown friends, my kids.
yeah.
I'm blah 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 blah. Right.
Right, right, right,
So, but anti means being disruptive.
right. Yeah,
When there are no black or brown people around
yeah,
in the spaces in segregated spaces, when you don't have that real person in the room, that part of your brain that goes, you know what, I need to speak up now.
yeah,
I need to bring a point of information. I need to redirect this, effort. I need to ask some really tough
yeah,
questions. So that kind of work is something that is often to be blunt, a burden that's placed on black and brown people of color. Women talk about this a lot in terms of in situations where they're the only woman on a board
right.
or the only
Sure.
woman in a firm, that they become like, Wonder Woman. They have to kind of advocate
Right.
for everything and how draining that is, how far that distracts and detracts from the actual work they have to do, how the rest of those folks don't have to do that work or that thinking. And
Right.
so
Right.
they're kind of, so I think that race kind of works the same way. I think that issues of racial justice and racial equity work the same way, which is really the burden is on the privileged group of people.
Yeah.
They're the ones that really in the balance need to do the work. And so I think there are some stages, there's some expertise, there's some guideposts, there's some cases, but I think it's convincing people to take that first step.
Yeah. I agree, and I understand what you mean, and um, I think that I think just to add to where I feel it's different is that I think uh white people are ready to be anti now, right? Like all the
Mm-hmm.
stages have been processed, and I
Mm-hmm.
think so many of us are like, okay, yeah, we get it. Like we understand um that it is important to do it, and we are ready. And then of course then we're met with this anxiety of, well, we don't want to overstep, and we don't want to
Mm-hmm.
make the same mistakes, whether we're good intention or not, right?
Right. Right.
And so it's very complex for everybody
It
uh,
is. Yeah.
involved. But what I'm happy about is, I just I feel like there's growth happening, and I
Yeah.
hope it's not just being me, just being an optimistic. And I hope that's what it is. But another thing that when you were talking about community work,
Mm-hmm.
the community work that I know that I've done with design charrettes, there's also a sense of uh, you failed us before. Like
Mm-hmm.
you've got our hopes up before. You came into this neighborhood, you
Mm-hmm.
said this, you said that, and you broke these promises,
Yes.
and so this mistrust with all
Yep.
the examples that you listed, and then this huge level of we're not going to do this again. And
Right.
maybe they've even like you know um I don't know how to I'll say it, but fell for it 3 4
Mm-hmm.
times in a row, and now this is the
Mm-hmm.
fifth time you're coming in and saying, hey, we're gonna fix this.
Right. I mean, I think communities, that's a legitimate observation that, I've done this 3 times, so I should do it the fourth with you. You
Yeah.
got enough data to suggest that this is not going to happen. And you and I at academic institutions are especially targeted for that, because we often use our communities as learning experiences for our students, which means that it could have gone on for generations even before we were even aware of it, right?
Yeah.
One example I can recount is uh, NC State, where I teach, is in Raleigh, North Carolina,
Sure.
and most southern cities, have a terrible kind of segregation past and Jim Crow. but we're, a mile and a half from the heart of one of Raleigh's oldest and most established Black communities, South Park, East Raleigh. And that was exactly the message that we received. The fact that I came in with Black skin didn't matter, right? It was more or less, I'm an academic and, what's going to change and, that kind of thing. And so it forced us to change our strategy and tactics. And, one thing that we learned was in some of these processes, it's important to create small wins along the way.
Yeah.
A lot of the work that we do takes time. And, if you're doing a plan, it takes a while to make the plan and it takes a while to capitalize a plan, it takes more time to implement the plan. And so, what you're really encouraging communities to get into in that particular situation is a very long commitment that in many cases outlasts your involvement, right? So, but there are ways along the way you can build in small wins that really help people in real time. And so, speaking of technology, that was one of the first research projects that I spent some time getting out there, was working with smartphones and teaching people how to do asset mapping and self-authored digital videos to tell stories about their neighborhood, and particularly to stories that no one knew, right? So not something you could find in an archive or written in the newspaper or that kind of thing. So cultural landscape stories. And it was that transfer of skill and technology. It was that empowerment, like instead of me telling people what the assets were, they were telling us, they were in charge, So even if the study stopped there, we never got further, there was something of like material benefit that they could use at that point. And so, that's something that I've tried to incorporate, and I would offer for folks who are listening who are concerned about that is, what can you do right now that meets a need in addition to your mission? Another example is actually hiring community people.
Great.
We ran into this before that, a lot of our work, we think this goes on to our traditional model, right? That it's worth it. Like the time that you invest in, working with communities, generating plans, moving through the process, you may not see things change for 4 to 5 years, but that commitment is worth it because in the end, it will produce something of lasting value, right? And a lot of communities are like, well, maybe not. And it's possible in a contingent situation, nothing changes. So, and you get paid for it, or if you are a consultant, or if you're an academic, you get research credit for it.
Yeah.
All we get is maybe, if we're lucky, a free dinner, and a way to converse with our friends. So it sounds kind of reductive, but I found that actually paying a living wage, being honest about the time commitments, valuing the time in the same way that we're benefiting, they're benefiting,
Yeah.
sends a completely different signal. They're like, look, we're all in this together. We're not hoarding all the benefits you can. So, and even in those cases, even if it doesn't turn into a real plan, people are like, look, I was able to buy groceries. I was able to
Right.
get transportation. I was able to, use those resources. So
Well, there's ownership then.
there's ownership. Exactly right. And,
Right.
and so convincing clients the value of that is difficult. We did that in that case. Again, it was foundation money, but it's really important,
I remember very clearly when we first met, and we met at ASLA 2017. And
Right.
the reason why I was drawn to you is because there was these long sheets of paper set out on these tables, and I think there was a bunch of like colored pencils or crayons,
Yeah.
and they were just
Oh yeah.
yeah,
I remember.
and they were just left there. And my background is fine art,
Hmm.
and I pass by and I see this just beautiful drawing, and I see this man just hunched over and just in it. I mean, you were in it. Like I was trying to like kind of say what's up, and like you were in the drawing, and I know that zone, so I just kind of let you be. I just hung out for a little while,
Yeah.
until you were done, and you leaned back and you looked at your piece and you were like, okay. And then I jumped in and I was like, hey man, that's a cool drawing. My name is Michael, and we started chatting.
Yeah.
And the reason why I bring up that story is because, that's what this interview should be about, right? It should be
Mm,
your work as a landscape architect, your work as an illustrator, your work as representing. And I know that, you know, cultural significance and all of that is part of our landscape, but to me, it's troublesome that, you know, it's like you have to be the representative,
mm.
if that makes sense, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I think
Um,
that, yeah,
what are
yeah.
your thoughts on that observation?
Well, on being a representative, I think that, uh, it harkens back to something earlier we were talking about in terms of, the burden that's
Yeah,
placed on people of, there's Howard Stern had the King of All Blacks was one of his characters on the Howard Stern radio show, and he
yeah,
was self-appointed, spokesperson for a whole culture, and which it's a farce, which kind of speaks to the point. But
sure.
I think that I have different views on it. Something that my mother told me many years ago is that it doesn't matter how you get in the door; it's what you do once you get in the room.
Yeah,
So, uh, there's lots of examples in other fields where a crisis that required a different way of looking at things created an opportunity for a group of people that would have never had an opportunity to do it. And then the question then becomes, after that crisis, how those people were able to kind of move through the system and impact it. So I look at it like this: that um, our numbers, not even just in landscape architecture, but in all the built environmental professions, are hover around 2% or lower.
right.
And in terms of educators and students, it's even lower than that. And so, in many ways, we are in that professional early stage of establishing patterns and perspectives, and that people are in that, they're just in that. Now, the other side of it is that once we're in the door, right, as we talked about, and we can keep talking about drawing if you want to, because that's really important to why I
Yeah,
chose landscape
sure.
architecture as a
Yeah,
career. But that's when you start to get those happy accidents and you start to build a culture, because there is a culture in design, there's a culture in landscape architecture that overlays with our own personal cultures, and we learn lessons from one another. So, I was the only Black student in my class. I had one Black faculty member in the Department of Landscape Architecture who was not tenure track. I worked in a firm that had in the office about 45 people, and actually their hiring practices were decent. There were about 7 or 8 Black folks, of which 3 of us were landscape architects. That's rare,
yeah,
even today to say those numbers. And that's back in the 90s, and in our department, I'm the only Black faculty member, and our Black student enrollment fluctuates. So in a lot of cases, we are, in that spot, but it's about managing the emotional burden of that, and about leaving, in my personal view, leaving the legacy so that the door stays open, right? So they're not like, this is trash, we're going to close the door, nobody else in. But man, we're going to not only do that, we're going to create more pathways for more people to come through. And I think we're just in that phase.
yeah. I mean, for me, I don't have to represent anything. I don't have any of that burden. The
Right,
only thing that I'm expected to do is my work,
right,
and that's it. And
right.
um, you know, but I have this big internal drive for advocacy for our profession,
Yeah.
and that's why I do this podcast. And
Mm-hmm.
at first, it was very light and very um, just highlighting the work that we do,
Yeah.
but it's evolved as I evolve and learn more and get to talk with all the luminaries in our field. I get to see how much deeper, well, just life in general is in the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, like, we really want this podcast to not be afraid to talk about anything.
Right.
And 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 so many people are willing to join us. I know that you mentioned that the ASLA Adapt has kind of recontextualized or referenced your work. And before I ask you a question on that, that was probably the beginning of my leadership and taking the podcast to something deeper. Was I interviewed the students that put together the ASLA Adapt,
Yeah.
and it came at a great cost to me. On
Hmm.
the podcast, I got a lot of backlash.
Hmm.
uh, Fortunately, I don't mind that stuff, and I'm willing to take the hits, but I was
Yeah.
very surprised at how actually dramatic it was.
Hmm.
um
Hmm.
so I guess I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but to bring it back to you and your work, you mentioned that you're aware that ASLA Adapt has uh, revisited your article. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. With the ASLA Adapt, um, taking interest in this particular article and this work, I think that it's been an interesting week. I was joking around with a friend a couple of days ago that, um, you know, after a while, I mean, when you write something and you know this as a faculty member, you're not sure who reads it.
Right.
You're not sure the impact. Like often we write for journals that no one's ever going to read.
Sure.
Present at conferences that no one goes to. So it's sort of, I don't say perfunctory, but it's sort of just, it's just the business, right? So when you have something that starts to get some traction, it's sort of exciting. So
Mhm.
I was on Instagram and Twitter, I think 2 or 3 days ago, and all of a sudden there are all these retweets and all these IG stories with that article, right? And so one person writes, "Yeah, it was required reading for my class," and I kind of went, "Oh, okay, cool. Maybe these are the Berkeley kids. They
Sure.
recycled this thing, and
Yeah.
they're sending it out and they're writing it, but it just keeps coming." And so, like literally 90 or 100 of these later, like, what the heck's going on? And so I get an email from a former student, brilliant woman, Anna Grace Fitzgerald, who said that ASLA Adapt is looking at that article and they're working on a statement. And my ignorance, I kind of went, "Well, what's ASLA Adapt?" And so I had to go back through the mental Rolodex, and it was the group that really pushed
Yeah.
ASLA to more visibly and vocally and prominently uh, work towards climate change, which is really brilliant work. Like you said, risky work. On the other side, with my SLA connections, there was work happening, but it encouraged them to be more visible and vocal with it, and led to other initiatives. So I think real change came from that agitation. And so, those are the two big pillars when I look at the 21st century of our profession. Right, the next 100 years, it's really what are we going to do about climate adaptation, and then what are we going to do about equity? Right, that's the second one. And so there's more momentum now to deal with the non-human sides of it, like how can we protect shorelines, how can we raise buildings, how can we relocate towns. There's a human component to it, but our profession is really more focused on the technical kind of execution of that. I never felt like the same bandwidth was given towards issue of environmental justice, social equity, and other elements. And so I was really heartened by that. The fact that I wasn't involved as the main advocate, but that value was seen in that academic product that could maybe lead to another push for change. So I don't know where it stands now, but I'm very happy and honored that they found a connection to that, and I support their advocacy.
Let's take it to a little bit of a lighter note for a minute.
All right.
um you, my friend, should have a Spotify playlist, because I follow you on Instagram, and I love the random, you know, like, one day I'll see, I don't know, Zap and Roger. Another day I'll see Parliament. Another day I'll see, Nipsey Hussle, or like, and it's good. It's good stuff. So, uh, I guess I'm asking you. You need to put a playlist together for these times.
That's good looking out. I have two kids. One's a teenager, and they hate my music. So it's good to hear somebody.
Really?
So, oh yeah. My daughter is 14, and she's like, "That's that old man music, isn't it?" And then
No, you don't
my
know.
son, who's 12, actually is a dancer.
Okay.
So he gives me a little bit of a pass. So if it has a
Yeah.
good danceable beat, he's good with it. But no, they're this old man music.
I got
But
to see
yeah.
I got to see Zap and Roger
Oh
uh,
wow.
play live together before
Wow.
before Roger died, right?
Yeah, that's right. He did.
Yeah. And I remember my friend, he questioned me on it because he's a black guy from Columbus, and we were talking about
Oh
Zap.
yeah. He's got to be on
Yeah,
it because they're
of course.
dating. Yeah. So
And
yeah, they're on it.
and I said, "Oh, I got to see him live," and immediately he was like, "What year?" Like I was guessing because he's like, I was like, "What are you trying? Why are you gonna try to test me on that?" But
Yeah.
then I told him the year, and he's like, "Okay, yeah, Roger was alive." I was like, why would I lie about that? But yeah, no, Ohio and Midwest, they have like
Oh yeah.
so much funk.
Great legacy, man. Great lakeside and
Yeah,
just on and on and on. Yeah, that's funny, and we should talk about your playlist too. But I, uh, I found landscape architecture through music.
oh wow.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I wanted to be a professional musician. I was on the track for a symphony orchestra.
Okay.
I played French horn. I went to a school called Interlochen Arts Academy, which is in northern Michigan, and I was literally on. Hey, I'm getting ready for auditions for college for music. But the fact that I was in the woods and I took an ecology class
Ah,
that taught me about wild edible plants and songbirds and camping and all that stuff. It was like a
yeah.
whole new world. And I kind of went, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so it was really being in that space. Music led me to that space, but it was being in that space that led to a major, aha moment in my life, which is like, no, I really need to figure out a way to do
Right.
this. But with music, yeah, it's just a part of me, man. I just really enjoy it. Yeah, I think that's really a nice thing with the social media. I think to even bring it in a contemporary way, the club quarantine stuff, the versus battles. Like, I mean, that's right up my alley, man. I
Yeah, yeah,
just love
yeah,
that
yeah.
stuff. So what are you listening to? What's on your playlist?
Um, you know, so I've gone full full circle, and what I've been listening to a lot is opera.
Oh wow, okay,
And it took me a long time to appreciate it.
yeah.
Um, and now, I mean, there's times where I'm on the verge of crying
Oh
listening
sure, yeah.
to
Oh,
it.
there's some heartbreaking stuff in there, man.
Yeah,
And
and
you get into Madame Butterfly, and you get into like
yeah,
stuff like
and
that. It's like, ooh, just rips your heart out.
yeah, it really, it really does. And of course, I have like really good Bose headphones, and so I listen to, uh, I've been listening to a lot of that. When I'm working, I'll put some like lo-fi beats on, just to get in that alpha brain or whatever.
Right, right.
Like, um, I
Yeah.
really got into Mac Miller,
Wow. Okay.
not too long ago. I
Okay.
was really moved by him.
Yeah.
Pretty sad that he died.
Right.
Um, but my big things were reggae. That's my
Oh, okay.
that's my
Sure.
that's my default. And then when my son was in the womb, there's all these studies that say, oh, have them play classical music so they're intelligent and all that stuff. And I
Right. Right.
had a different approach, and my approach was, I want my son to be cool and chill. So what I did was I got headphones, and I found like the safest reggae ever was Bob Marley's Legend, and I would
Sure.
put the headphones on my wife's stomach and play that, and that was my way of like starting early in the womb. And then the funny thing is when he was actually born and he would start crying or freaking out and we couldn't control it, I would just
Yeah.
throw on that album and he would immediately chill out. And I was like,
Wow.
okay. I was
That
like,
is so cool. That is so
I don't know if
cool.
it works or not, or if there's a correlation, but
That's wonderful, man. Yeah, the vibes, man. I think we that's a landscape we don't understand. Like we got I got some students and some really, really sharp former students who were studying soundscapes.
Yeah.
Now they're studying it for a different purpose, right? They're studying it to figure out, the extensive bird habitats or the influence of road noise, that sort of thing. But soundscapes in terms of how their effect on human beings
Yeah.
in a positive way, right? And I think that is going to be more important now that we're trying to get through COVID and figure out what to do in public spaces. And
Yeah.
we have all this portable technology. Why not use it, in the interest of keeping people kind of on top of their game, balanced, emotionally healthy, that kind of thing.
By any
So I'm
chance,
all over it.
yeah, by any chance, are you shifting around a piece of paper as you talk?
I don't believe I
Okay.
am, but it's possible this thing is rubbing against my shirt,
Okay,
so I
that's fine.
can try and stay more still.
No,
Okay.
no, no, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate your uh your 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 music list that you post because
Well, thank you.
as you remember, what we did was we made mixtapes, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And like it was two types of mixtapes. It was one for you and your boys, and then
Yes.
there's another one for the girl you were trying to court,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they both
Yes.
had different strategies.
They
And
had very different strategies. That's right.
yeah, and
And I
one of
have
them,
a friend, yeah, one of my
what's that?
best friends, one of my best friends
Sure.
figured out how to record on a videotape.
Yeah,
So he would have like 8-hour mixes for
sure.
either purpose, and so yeah, that you're right. Mixtape culture, it's interesting because a lot when I look at a lot of contemporary art, you can kind of see the influence of DJ culture and mixtape
Yeah.
culture on that as well. It kind of aligns with people with short attention span. It even the tools that we have, like the interfaces for how we edit music, how we edit video, are in a way sort of DJ based. So idea of sampling, mixing, cutting, and there are cultural implications of that as well. I mean, I've found that, I grew up in Detroit in the, 80s, and that was the birth of Detroit techno music. And, at that time, Detroit was 80% Black. But if you ever went to a techno party or rave, or Detroit Electronic Music Fest, I mean, everybody was out there, and so there was some sort of unified
Yeah.
cultural moment, that allow people to kind of occupy a different space. I think it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so your work now, I know that you're very much focused on the environment, and I know that prior to us meeting today, you were alluding to that perhaps these protests were a precursor to what's to come in regards to environmental change. Can you
Yeah,
tell me a little bit about what you were alluding to?
sure. I do think that what we're witnessing now is building on an underlying issue that we can't really figure out yet. There's an interesting political cartoon that's going around that shows a boxing match, and there's like signs on each of the boxers, and one sign is America, and the other boxer that's kicking his butt is racism. But on the rope,
Mhm.
waiting to get into the match, is a figure that's twice their size. It's called climate.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at. I think that at this point, we are dealing with the consequences of like austerity and unemployment. And so there's definitely some deprivation there. But when we get into the age of mass migrations and coastal cities within
Resource
years of
wars.
being underwater, yeah, resource wars. I mean, I think we're seeing the leading edge of that, and that's another reason why I think there's a sense of urgency to resolve these issues we have now, or to move in that direction, because we're going to have to supersize all of it in order to adapt. So I think in a lot of ways, that's the imperative to me, is get this right so that we're better prepared to take on the real champion that's coming, and that's climate change.
So if I could try to repeat this back to you just to see if I got it right, what you're saying is if we could get this this race issue, the methodologies that we use to resolve this race issue and grow, and how to learn from our protests and listening and talking with each other, that could be a great exercise then into how we're going to have to deal with more monumental shifts coming our way.
Yeah, that's one way of stating it. But I just realized in saying it, I didn't give you an underlying assumption that I have about all this stuff.
Yes, please. What's the
Uh,
assumption?
well, we're never gonna
Yeah.
figure it out. I think that what I hope comes out of this current situation are the counterbalances. You know, I remember I teach a class on social equity and environmental justice, and every year I ask the students to name a just place, like any place in the landscape where they feel like, as a human being, you know, they matter, they're understood. It's easy for them to engage. They don't feel fear. They feel like they can be their whole selves, like in a public place. And in 3 years, no one's ever named a place,
Hmm.
and it's led to a very interesting conversation. And it turns out that what they were responding to is to come up like some magic, like Disney World kind of
Right.
place, rather than the forces that impact equity and justice, which is to say, you know, fairness and accessibility and the checks and balances of law and enforcement, the you know, multilingual spaces, you know, spaces that don't privilege particular cultures. So when you start to pull it apart, you never get a permanent fixed solution, but you get all of the controls that can adjust on the fly to make those
Right.
places work better, right? So my underlying assumption coming out of this is that no, we're not going to done with the race issue. Let's move on. But what
Right.
we can do is perfect and speculate on the tools and the levers that are required to counterbalance when things get out of balance, right? And so I think that that is sort of analogous to climate, because climate is dynamic.
Right.
uh, it's very hard for people to pinpoint exactly what's going to happen, although we see the trends.
Right.
So it's going to take sort of this agility, right, of figuring out how to respond, how to adapt, how to learn from it quickly, and then get to it. And so the fact that we can deal with that in a human, although climate is human,
Right.
which
Right.
is a whole nother conversation, but this current situation, that experience with the younger people, with generations that may not have the baggage that, you know, our parents did, that they build a comfort level and a facility with being dynamic in that way. It will better prepare them when we're faced with a really, really tough global challenge.
I just rewatched The Matrix, the first one, and if you remember correctly, or if you remember, when he was explaining how the first Matrix failed because they tried to make a utopia.
Too perfect, that's right. They were rejecting it.
They were
I remember that.
rejecting it,
The architect, yeah.
the architect, and then it was like, oh, let's, but there's lots of examples of failed utopias, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
and I don't, and I understand now why they fail, because
Mm.
um we are complex. I don't want to frame it from a human sense that we are complex, although we are very
Mhm.
complex, but nature itself is complex, right? Like the
Absolutely.
design, and there's so many different systems that utopias just don't. It's not. You know. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, there's a podcast about failed utopias.
Oh, that would be interesting to hear.
That's excellent. I'll share the link after our conversation. I believe it's called.
After you make your playlist,
Yeah, I'll make the okay. It's on my list. Playlist first,
10 songs,
podcast second.
10,
But
10,
they
10 songs to get us through just a week.
right, right. Well, you know, I don't think it's the utopias. I think it's trying to build the utopias.
Oh, right.
Uh, so you know, there's the great story of Frank Lloyd Wright, um, who came up with Broadacre City as his utopian American community. That was a model that he tinkered in his basement. Like, he didn't reveal this thing until later in his career and in his life, but he was using all the projects he worked on as sort of data points to inform this broader vision, you know, which was never built, obviously. In architecture as well, there's Corbusier,
Mhm.
who, you know, before World War II, everyone thought he was out to lunch,
Right.
in terms of, he wanted to level entire parts of Paris and towers into green and all this stuff. But then in World War II, they had a question about how they wanted to rebuild, and all of his stuff was modular and used precast concrete and, a lot of the technologies that were much more affordable and accessible. But, he made great buildings, but he made really lousy cities,
Right.
So,
Yeah.
the danger to me is I don't have a problem with utopia as a model, like to test ideas, but I have a problem with trying to execute a utopia. That's when it just turns sideways. And that's urban renewal. I mean, that's our legacy in the United States, is the attempt to take that international modernist, rational planning, Corbusier informed strategy to American cities, to the detriment of Black and brown people.
Yeah. What uh, let's zoom in a little bit locally, in because you're in North Carolina now, right?
Yep, I am. Yep.
And what issues are particular to North Carolina? And NC is
State.
in NC State is in Raleigh, correct?
Yeah, in Raleigh, that's right.
In
Hmm.
Raleigh. So
Hmm.
what challenges does that city have that you are seeing that might be unique to other cities?
Hmm. Okay, that's a really good question. Raleigh is the state capital. And when I moved to North Carolina in the early 2000s, it was still a very sleepy government town. There wasn't a lot of activity downtown. The walkability was a little weird. We have an excellent greenway system, so I'll give a
Oh,
shout out
great.
to our greenways. But in terms of just the livability of it, so um, for a lot of reasons, Raleigh is a part of the Research Triangle, and is unique in the country in that it has 3 Research One universities, a 9,000-acre tech park, and a world-class airport within 20 minutes of each other. So you have Duke, UNC, and Chapel Hill, and NC State, where we are. So there's a lot of really, and our college grads tend to stay in the area. So consistently in a lot of surveys, we have some of the highest levels of education in any
Wow, that's
region. Yeah.
great.
And this is the flip side of having a very conservative Republican legislature. We also have some of the friendliest business policies and taxes in the country.
Before you go on,
Hmm.
was Raleigh then on the short list for Amazon's new headquarters? It seems
It
like,
was. It
yeah, it seems like
was.
you would have met all of those.
It was. That's right.
And then what
Yeah.
was that discussion like? Not to veer you too off,
Oh
but
no, it's fine. I think it actually ties to a lot of these particular issues. I mean, I think that um, I have a lot of feelings about the approach that Amazon took.
right,
So
we all do. Yeah.
yeah, and so I'll give the punchline in a second, but I think that at the time people were very optimistic, and this goes back to the utopian conversation we just had, which was, if anybody's going to promise 10,000 jobs, tech jobs, and then you do all the spinoff, benefits
Mhm,
of that, like how much
mhm.
retail that kicks off, housing, services, then yeah, cities were, literally begging for Amazon to come. And so the area that they were considering was adjacent to our campus. We have a tech campus, and so they wanted to kind of co-locate and kind of benefit from that. So, but the conversation, quite frankly, was uh, uh, kind of hidden and not really publicly visible or accessible. It was really sort of a closed door kind of thing. And so that sent a signal. But what happened in Brooklyn, so
Yeah.
AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, famously kind of threw Amazon, to the woodshed, saying like, look, you're the world's richest corporation. You don't pay any taxes. Why should we give you anything? You
Right.
should be, in the market like everybody else. People took it as a slap in the face.
There's even
But
talk that Amazon already knew that they were going, and they just dangled this carrot to all the other cities as
sure.
incentive, as a leverage incentive.
So
Which,
here's the punchline.
yeah,
Um, the punchline is that they didn't have to give back any of the data they collected from all these cities.
that's exact right. They just got everything for free.
So Amazon knows more about America's biggest cities than the
Yeah.
U.S. government now.
Yeah.
So this is sort of indicative of how the real power of corporations, the real power of private entities. It's not to say that a Rockefeller or where I'm from, a Fisher family or a Kellogg
Yeah.
or, any of these like huge, industrial giants in the past didn't do the same thing. And I think in some cases we can see the benefits to the public, right? So Rockefeller Center is like, that's where you ice skate and, you do thing
Right.
for Christmas in New York. Like that has nothing to do with, the business that they took care of. It has to do with what they enabled, the Carnegies in Pittsburgh. Like it just goes on and on and on. So it's not to poo-poo that, but it's to say that we're in a situation, and landscape architecture plays a role as well, because co-located with those kinds of things are some of the great landscapes that we really celebrate now. As examples of what we should do, right? So Hudson Yards, the High Line in New York, the Atlanta Belt Line, like there are all these prestige projects essentially that we have to stay diligent as the public to make sure that they remain accessible, that they don't displace people, that they actually provide the value that the landscape can provide. But Amazon for sure exploited many cities, unfortunately.
Yeah. The cities voluntarily gave up everything.
They did.
Now, you mentioned the term, a fee structure model of how we as landscape architects are financed, and I'm
Yes.
curious if if there's room for us to be our own developers, and I don't know if there are any. Well, there are some trusts, but should we as a profession move towards being more of our own developers, being our own clients in a way?
That's a really good question. Landscape architects being their own clients. I think that I'm seeing different trends. One trend I'm seeing more prominently is the design build trend,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say that the landscape architect is not just instructing others in how to build the landscapes they want to build, but they know how to do that as well. And particularly in the space with green infrastructure and at smaller scales, it's something that's thriving actually. And
There's
so
there's bigger money.
there's bigger money, right?
Yeah.
But that idea of a bit of all meaning, I think there's a stereotype of in some worlds that the landscape architect um, does not build. They're
Right.
just sort of paper architects.
Right. Sure.
And if an engineer or an architect can do the same sort of thing, then why do I need a landscape architect? There's like weird stuff going on. So I think that's one trend that's sort of breaking it down to a smaller unit, but more globally, I'm reminded of the Rural Studio story with the great Sambo Mokbee in Auburn University, where he wanted to do what we now know as public interest design, but he couldn't make a living,
Mm.
And so he ended up taking over the construction studio sequence at Auburn. And so that provided financial stability, being tied to university, but allowed him to take on projects and relationships and build partnerships that would not be possible in the corporate structure. And a lot of the folks that I admire around the country, I like the Detroit Collaborative Design Center, U of D Mercy in Detroit. I like what they do a lot. I like the Arkansas Design Center. I like a number of these sort of hybrid situations where the profit motive is diminished because there's a public support, but you're still entrepreneurial, right? You're still able to kind of deal with your practice. So my guess is that that trend could add a lot of benefit, and so it could go to other institutions. Like I don't know why like hospitals don't have landscape architects, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Considering all the health benefits that come from landscape architecture, I don't know why a lot of faith-based organizations don't have landscape architects like as a part of their staff, because I think how we engage people and engage with however they choose to express their faith is, the landscape plays a key role. So I think there's going to be some hybrids moving forward where, but I don't see a future where the majority of our profession is not fee for service. I think that's just always going to be there.
Yeah. How do you, you're also a practicing landscape architect, correct?
I consult every once in a while. Yeah, I'm pretty
Mhm.
strategic with it, but yes.
But
Mhm.
you're in the know.
Yeah, a little bit.
Um, how do you personally see the relationship between academia and landscape architecture right now?
That's a great question. I think it varies from program to program. I think
Mhm.
that accreditation provides sort of a common ground for everybody. But as you know, accreditation requirements are currently going through a massive change. So the last time they were updated 10 years ago, that's when landscape performance became a requirement
Yeah.
for programs. And this go around, there's a lot of questions about, well, how do we update now?
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the ASLA adapts. Programs, not all programs offer coursework on climate change right now, but I'm guessing that's probably going to be in the new accreditation guidelines. There's a major push for diversity, equity, and inclusion being a factor in curriculum and programmatic things. I think that's going to change. But I think in terms of the corporate world, it's faster, I would say. We're in a different position than a lot of other professions where the corporate private sector in some cases moving further faster than the research and education sector. So if you look at leading landscape architects, some of the stuff that they're doing now is way beyond the capacity that a lot of institutions have, unless they're, Ivy Leagues. So we're still kind of on the basics of like getting people prepared in terms of research that's not directly tied to practice. It's hit or miss. I mean, NC State, our biggest research engine is actually landscape architecture, and it's the Natural Learning Initiative, which is led by Robin Moore and Nilda Costco, and they specialize in children's learning environments, and they were ahead of the curve dealing with the value of nature to learning, to brain development, to emotional development, and have really just become a powerhouse. And so it's spun off into funded research and all manner of things. And so they actually, in some cases, do operate like a firm because they're unique. They have such a depth of knowledge that no other firm has that kind of knowledge. So they really don't compete with others because they're so specialized. But they sustain themselves. But I think that's the future in some cases of education. The institutes, labs, centers that bring together different disciplines to create a unique niche, right? So the next one from Natural Learning Initiative is the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab that Andy Fox and David Hill run, which is dealing with resilience and dealing with issues in the coast of North Carolina. And we have others. So I think that what's probably occurring is, I won't say hyper specialization, but I'll say unique sort of niche specialization so that programs will distinguish themselves not because of their general education, but because of their advanced, more specialized kind of training. And that will bring value to practice. And really that's the push in practice that I'm seeing is clients demanding more evidence-based work. So not just saying, do it because it's pretty, do it because we like it, do it because I can quantify the benefits, like human benefits, ecological benefits, other benefits. And so institutions and education is perfectly positioned to help with that.
What's your favorite class to teach?
My favorite class to teach. You know what? There are moments in a number of classes that I like. I teach a theory and criticism class.
Okay.
And part of that class is sort of a sensing exercise where I ask each person throughout the semester to put together like a 5-minute presentation on uh, the landscape or the landscape architect that got them uh, motivated to pursue landscape architecture. Like what's the thing or who's the person. And it's funny because I do a survey like the first day of class. I'm like, okay, we're going to sign up for dates. Each class is going to lead off with like one or two people getting up and talking about, their favorite landscape or favorite landscape architect. And they all kind of panic
Mm.
because they all want to sound cool. So they want to name drop some cool person. I'm like, I don't know that person. He's not that
Sure,
cool.
sure, sure, sure.
Or show some project they've never been to. And I kind of give them some guidelines. I'm like, if you're going to show a landscape,
Yeah,
unless it really, the image alone really motivated you, then you really
yeah.
should pick one that you've been to,
You
And
know what it
so,
is? It's the fragrance at your grandma's house. That,
yes,
it's those.
yes,
You just have to
yes,
dig deep to get
yes,
there.
yeah. So it's funny because, we teach in the United States and we have a number of international students. And by the time I see them, they're still learning American culture. They're still learning to communicate in English and, some insecurity with that. But you get them talking about a favorite landscape at home. And really
Mm,
the showstopper was we had a Persian young lady maybe 4 or 5 years ago who gave us a tour of Tehran.
mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, if you ever seen a presentation that was a mic drop, that was a mic drop,
Yeah.
because she shows this opening slide. And I think that this is American poor education, right? When you think of Iran and that part of the world, you're thinking desert and you're thinking war torn and you're thinking all this other stuff, right? We're talking about some of the oldest cultures on earth, right? And so she shows, the first thing is this panoramic Tehran nestled against this mountain range. So it's basically New York City against the mountains is what it is, right? And so we get like 2 or 3 slides in and somebody stops her. It's like, excuse me, I thought you were going to show Tehran.
Yeah.
Like, and she was like, that is Tehran. And I was like, what?
Mhm.
So it was just one of those
Right.
complete reversals, like, oh my God, so that particular exercise I like. But my favorite class by far is I teach a class on social equity and environmental
Yeah.
justice. And I like that because it attracts a lot of disciplines. So
Mm,
we had 5 different, you know, uh, departments represented in that class,
I
and,
see.
and and rare for a grad class, we had a number of PhDs taking essentially a grad class because it shows sort of the passion for this generation of really wanting to engage the really hard problems. And it emphasizes engagement strategies, like working with people that are different from you. How do you sense their needs, develop programs that are geared towards their capabilities, do real-time checking, and they always shine in that class. Like they always rise to the challenge. The community is always really pleased with the work. It has high impact. And so that's by far, I think, my favorite class.
Cool. Cool. I wish I could take it.
You can, it'll be online, so
Oh, that's great.
you can audit it.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I should. Um, well, thank you so much for your time. I'm grateful to have uh spent my day with you talking, and I wanted to know if you had any closing thoughts or ideas that you wanted to share.
Sure. Closing thoughts. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you again, Michael. It was a pleasure meeting you the first time. I believe in LA, so in your hometown, which I thought was great. And I'm glad we were able to share some time again today. I want to say to everyone that's listening, know that it's a trying time. It's a difficult time, and a lot of us are, checking our priorities and reflecting and figuring out what we're going to do to move forward. And I just want to say that uh, that there is revision led. Designers have to be optimistic. It's going to take a lot of work, but there is a way out of this. It's hard to hear this in some cases, but as I hear from my parents, my mother, and from older generations, this is not the worst it has been, as bad as it seems. So there are data points that suggest that we'll get through it. And I think that I appreciate you and others asking the really tough questions about the future of the profession. We can't go back to business as usual after this. We have to reach for something new. And I'm glad that there are a lot of people having that conversation right now.
Awesome. Um, all right. Well, yeah. Uh, this is a hard episode to end because,
Mm.
you know, it's more of a conversation and a dialogue than it is, this is the great work that I do, wrap it
Yeah.
all nice in a bow. Here's my
Right.
project. Here's the finished photos.
Right.
Um, you know, it's more of a living episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
But that's what counts. So, you know, um, maybe another time we can talk about the work.
I would
but
love
but
to. You know,
we can just talk about the work and then we can
yeah,
think about different things.
we'll have a swear jar where anytime we divert, we just have to put you have to Venmo each other a dollar, and we'll just talk about the work. And
I didn't know you let people curse on this thing. I feel gypped now. I would have definitely
oh
dropped a few
man,
bombs on you.
we I encourage it. That, you know, somebody told me somewhere sometime, they said never trust anyone that doesn't curse.
Yeah, I agree.
And I
I
like
agree.
that, and I agree because well, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't.
Yep, yeah. It's funny. I try not to curse around my kids, but if you're over 18, it's just fair game. You know.
Yeah, well, in the car, it's a safe zone for Papa. Papa's gonna curse. And then there's also a no kids music rule in the car ever since he was
Oh,
born.
nice rule.
Yeah,
Nice rule.
I'm not
I have
gonna
I have the jazz rule in my car. So all
only
we
jazz in
listen
the car.
only jazz. We have an excellent local college radio station that plays jazz 24 hours a day. Good jazz too, not like
Sure,
poppy jazz.
I can't do
And
poppy.
yeah, and so yeah, and actually it's funny because the kids when they were little they hated it, but now they
Yeah,
tolerate it. They won't say they like it, but they tolerate it now. So
they tolerate. I think they'll come around. They'll understand it one day.
yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Michael. You have a good evening.
All right. Okay.
My
Talk to
best to you. Take care. Okay.